Welcome to Buddha's Healing, a quiet space where we gently reflect on the wisdom of the Buddha and learn how to live with greater peace, compassion, and emotional healing in everyday life. Dear friends, there is something deeply human about holding on. We hold on to memories, we hold on to people, we hold on to expectations, we hold on to pain, sometimes. We even hold on to the very things quietly hurting us. Why? Because letting go feels frightening. Letting go feels uncertain. Letting go can feel like loss. And yet, what if the suffering we fear most is not in letting go, but in continuing to carry what has already become too heavy? Have you ever noticed this? Sometimes the body becomes tired even when life seems relatively stable. Sleep feels restless. The chest feels heavy. The mind feels crowded. Joy feels harder to access. Patience grows thinner, and quietly, something inside whispers, "I am exhausted." But perhaps the exhaustion is not only physical. Perhaps the heart has simply been carrying too much for too long. The Buddha often reminded us of something both simple and profound. Much of suffering comes from attachment, from clinging, from holding too tightly, not because love is wrong, not because caring is wrong, but because grasping creates tension, fear, resistance, and emotional heaviness. We hold tightly to how life should have gone. We hold tightly to how people should behave. We hold tightly to old pain, old identities, old disappointments, old stories, and often, we do this so gradually that we hardly notice. Until one day, the body begins speaking, sometimes through anxiety, sometimes through exhaustion, sometimes through sleepless nights, sometimes through sadness we cannot explain, sometimes through a feeling that life has somehow become heavier. Especially after 50, because after 50, many people begin carrying invisible emotional weight accumulated across decades. A painful divorce still remembered 20 years later. A family conflict still replayed inside the mind. Fear about aging, fear about health, fear about loneliness, the pressure to stay strong, the disappointment of unmet expectations, regret over lost time. Dear friends, please hear this gently. None of this makes you weak. This is part of being human. Life leaves marks on all of us. No one reaches 50, 60, or 70 without carrying some sorrow, some disappointment, some grief, some unfinished story. But there comes a moment in life when we quietly begin asking, is carrying all of this still helping me, or is it slowly hurting me? Because sometimes, the thing that once protected us becomes the thing exhausting us. Resentment once felt protective. Now it feels heavy. Control once felt safe, now it feels stressful. Fear once felt responsible, now it feels overwhelming. Holding on once felt necessary, now it simply feels painful. And yet, letting go is difficult, very difficult. Especially when pain has lived with us for years. Especially when disappointment shaped part of who we became. Especially when identity quietly formed around suffering. Many people say, I know I should let it go. But deep inside, something still clings. Why? Because pain can become strangely familiar, predictable, even comfortable in an uncomfortable way. The mind returns to old wounds because old wounds feel known. And what feels known often feels safer than uncertainty, even suffering. But dear friends, the Buddha offered another way. Not avoidance, not denial, not pretending pain never happened, but understanding, awareness, compassion, and release, a gentle loosening of the grip, not because the past suddenly disappears, but because peace matters too. Today, we will gently reflect on 6 things people often hold onto so tightly that they quietly begin harming emotional well-being, inner peace, and even physical health, not through punishment, not because life is unfair, but because emotional heaviness eventually asks something from the body. The 6 things we will explore together are: holding onto resentment, holding onto fear and worry, holding onto control, holding onto painful memories, holding onto unrealistic expectations, and perhaps the hardest one of all, holding onto the need to always be right. Perhaps as we move through today's reflection, you may recognize parts of yourself, and if you do, please be gentle. This is not about blame. This is about healing, because awareness is where healing begins. Sometimes, the most loving thing we can do for ourselves is not hold tighter, but loosen our grip. Breathe deeper and quietly ask, what am I carrying that no longer belongs in my heart, dear friends? There is a quiet wisdom that often comes with age, the realization that peace matters more than winning. Rest matters more than proving. Connection matters more than control. And health. Health matters more than emotional battles that never truly end. Because sometimes, the greatest act of self-respect is not fighting harder, but finally saying, I do not want to suffer this way anymore. And perhaps that moment can begin today. So before we continue, take one slow breath. Let your shoulders soften and gently ask yourself, what have I been holding onto that is quietly holding onto me? Because, dear friends, sometimes illness begins not only in the body. Sometimes it begins in the emotional weight we were never taught how to set down. Let us begin with the first thing many people hold onto for far too long, something that quietly becomes heavy. Something that often feels justified, something that can live inside the heart for years, sometimes decades. And that is resentment, old hurt, old disappointment, unspoken anger, the emotional weight of what someone did or failed to do. Perhaps someone betrayed your trust. Perhaps someone abandoned you when you needed them most. Perhaps a family relationship broke apart. Perhaps painful words were spoken years ago, yet somehow still echo inside today. And if this sounds familiar, please know this gently. You are not wrong for hurting. Pain is real. Disappointment is real. Grief is real. The Buddha never taught people to deny suffering. He taught us to understand it, to sit beside it with awareness, to stop running from it. But dear friends, there is something important we must reflect on. Pain hurts, but holding on to pain too tightly often hurts even more, because resentment changes shape over time. At first, it feels like protection. I'll never let that happen again. I'll never trust that person again. They hurt me, and perhaps they truly did, but years later something subtle happens. The person may move on. Life changes, circumstances change, yet emotionally, we continue reliving the same wound again and again. And again, the body remembers, the nervous system remembers, the heart remembers, and without realizing it, we begin carrying emotional stress every single day. Dear friends, have you ever noticed how exhausting unresolved anger feels? How tiring it becomes to replay the same emotional story. How heavy resentment can feel in the chest. How difficult peaceful sleep becomes when the heart is still fighting yesterday. This is not weakness. This is simply what emotional heaviness does. The Buddha once compared anger to holding hot coal with the intention of throwing it at someone else. Before it reaches another person, it burns the one holding it. And resentment often works the same way. The heart stays tense, the body stays guarded, stress quietly builds, and over time, that emotional tension can begin affecting well-being in ways we do not immediately recognize. Patience grows thinner. Sleep becomes lighter, energy lowers, joy feels farther away, sometimes even relationships suffer. Because old pain quietly shapes new moments. Perhaps someone disappoints us today, and suddenly pain from 10 years ago rises too. Not because the current moment caused all the hurt, but because old wounds never fully healed. Dear friends, many people after 50 quietly carry emotional histories no one sees. A difficult marriage, family betrayal, disappointment with children, friendships that ended painfully, regret, loss, unspoken grief, and sometimes the heart becomes so used to carrying hurt that heaviness begins feeling normal. But what if it is not supposed to feel normal? What if peace has simply been buried beneath years of emotional weight? Today we are not asking, were you hurt? Because perhaps you were. Today we are gently asking something else. How long do you want to keep carrying the hurt? The Buddha taught that attachment creates suffering. An emotional attachment to pain may be one of the deepest forms of suffering many people experience. Not because suffering makes us bad, but because clinging exhausts the spirit. Many people misunderstand forgiveness. They think forgiveness means, what happened was okay, but forgiveness is not approval. Forgiveness is not pretending the wound never existed. Forgiveness simply says, I no longer want this pain controlling my peace. Dear friends, that is very different. You can remember what happened. You can honor your experience. You can protect your boundaries and still choose peace, because forgiveness is often less about them and more about your nervous system, your sleep, your heart, your emotional freedom. The truth is, many people are not sick because life is impossible. Many people are exhausted because they have been emotionally fighting old battles for too long, battles that no longer need to continue. Imagine carrying a heavy suitcase every single day. At first, perhaps you barely notice it, but after years, your shoulders ache, your back hurts, you become tired. Resentment works the same way. At first, it feels manageable. Then it becomes emotional weight. Eventually, it becomes identity. This is what happened to me. This is why I am guarded. This is why I can trust. This is why I feel bitter. And suddenly, the wound begins shaping the person. But dear friends, you are more than your pain. You are more than what happened to you. The hardest experiences of life matter. But they do not have to become permanent emotional homes. Perhaps tonight, you may ask yourself gently, what resentment have I been carrying? Has holding onto it protected me, or has it quietly exhausted me? Sometimes, the first step toward healing is simply becoming honest enough to admit, I am tired of carrying this. And sometimes, that quiet honesty becomes the beginning of freedom. There was a man named David. He was 66 years old, living in a quiet neighborhood outside Chicago. If you met him for the first time, you might have described him as successful. He had spent nearly 40 years building a business, raised 2 children, retired comfortably, owned a beautiful home. And from the outside, life looked stable, but inside, David carried something heavy, something invisible, something he rarely talked about. A resentment he had been holding for nearly 15 years toward his younger brother, Mark. The pain began after their father passed away. Grief was already heavy, but family tension made it worse. Arguments over responsibilities, misunderstandings about finances, old childhood wounds suddenly resurfacing. Things left unsaid for decades finally spilling out. One painful afternoon turned into shouting. The kind of argument that says too much. The kind that leaves silence afterward. The kind that changes something. Mark said things David never forgot. David said things he later regretted. Then came distance. Months passed. No calls, no holidays together. Eventually, years passed. At first, David convinced himself he was fine. He crossed the line. I don't need people like that. He should apologize, and maybe part of that was true. Maybe Mark had hurt him deeply, but something else quietly happened too. The resentment stayed alive. Long after the fight had ended, David replayed conversations in his mind. imagined arguments, thought about what he should have said, sometimes while driving, sometimes before sleep, sometimes while eating dinner, and without realizing it, he carried emotional tension almost everywhere. His wife Susan noticed changes over time. David became more impatient, more irritable, harder to talk to, sometimes emotionally distant. Little things triggered frustration. One evening at dinner, Susan asked gently, "Do you ever miss your brother?" David looked away, not angry, just tired. After a long silence, he muttered, "Sometimes," then quietly added, "But I am still mad." The truth, he wasn't only angry anymore, he was exhausted. Holding resentment had become emotionally expensive, but after so many years, he no longer knew how to put it down. A few months later, David visited his doctor for routine blood work. Nothing alarming, but stress markers were high. Blood pressure higher than usual, poor sleep continuing. The doctor asked, "How's life emotionally?" David laughed softly. "What does that even mean?" The doctor smiled. "It means, are you carrying anything heavy?" For some reason, that question stayed with him, carrying anything heavy. That night, David sat alone in the garage. Quiet, no television, no distractions, just silence and memory. He realized something uncomfortable. The argument with Mark lasted one afternoon, but emotionally, he had been reliving it for 15 years. 15 years, and suddenly, he felt tired, not angry, just deeply tired, tired of replaying the story. Tired of defending himself in conversations that no longer existed. Tired of carrying emotional armor. Weeks later, Susan gently suggested attending a mindfulness talk at a nearby Buddhist center. Normally, David would have refused, but something in him felt worn down enough to try. The teacher that evening spoke softly. No dramatic language, no pressure, just calm honesty. At one point, the teacher said, "Sometimes we mistake holding on for strength." The room grew quiet. Then came another sentence. "But often true strength begins when we finally loosen our grip." David sat completely still. Then the teacher added, "Holding pain may feel like protection, but eventually protection becomes prison." Something inside David cracked open, because for the first time, he realized resentment had not been protecting him anymore. It had been exhausting him, quietly, slowly, for years. A few days later, David found himself staring at his phone. Mark's number still saved. His thumb hovered, then stopped, then hovered again. He almost gave up. Almost convinced himself it was pointless, but finally, he called. No speech prepared, no dramatic reconciliation planned. Just one sentence, awkward, simple, quiet. "Hey, it's been a long time." Silence. Then Mark's voice, older, softer. "Yeah," Mark said quietly, "it has." The healing wasn't immediate. There were difficult conversations. Awkward pauses. Old hurts, tears, honesty, but slowly something changed. They began speaking again. Coffee once a month, phone calls, family dinners, small things, human things, and strangely, David began changing too. He slept better, laughed more, his patience returned. Even Susan noticed. One afternoon she smiled and said, "You seem lighter." David laughed softly. "I think I finally got tired of carrying bricks, and for the first time in years." He meant it, dear friends. Perhaps there is a David somewhere inside many of us, an old hurt, a disappointment, a person we cannot stop replaying, pain that quietly became part of daily life. Please hear this gently. You do not have to deny what happened. You do not have to pretend it did not hurt, but perhaps you no longer need to carry it every single day, because resentment often promises protection, but eventually, it quietly becomes exhaustion, not always dramatic, just heavy, and heavy things become harder to carry with age. Sometimes letting go does not happen all at once. Sometimes healing begins with honesty, with one quiet sentence. I am tired of suffering this way, and dear friends, sometimes that sentence changes everything. If today's reflection touched your heart, please subscribe to Buddhist Healing and continue walking this healing journey with us. And if there is something heavy your heart has carried for too long, perhaps leave a gentle comment below. Sometimes healing begins when we finally admit what hurts. Let us gently move into the second thing many people hold onto so tightly that it quietly begins harming peace, emotional well-being, and even physical health. And that is fear and constant worry. This burden is incredibly common, especially after 50, because after 50, life begins asking different questions, questions that can feel heavier than before. What if my health changes? What if something happens to my spouse? What if retirement isn't enough? What if my children struggle? What if I become alone? What if I lose my independence? And slowly, without even realizing it, many people begin living inside imagined futures. The body sits here, but the mind travels somewhere frightening. Tomorrow, next year, worst-case scenarios, problems that may never arrive. And dear friends, please hear this gently. Fear is not weakness. Worry is not failure. These are deeply human experiences. The Buddha never asked people to stop feeling fear. He understood fear. He understood uncertainty. He understood suffering. But he also taught something profoundly compassionate. Fear becomes suffering when we begin living inside it. There is a difference between concern and chronic worry. Concern says, I will prepare wisely. Worry says, I must mentally suffer in advance. Concern helps us act. Worry quietly drains us. And many people after 50 become emotionally exhausted, not because life is impossible, but because the mind never rests. Even peaceful moments become interrupted. A beautiful dinner becomes worry about bills. A family gathering becomes worry about health. A quiet evening becomes fear about the future. Even vacations feel stressful, because the mind keeps asking, what if, what if, what if, what if? Dear friends, a mind constantly bracing for disaster rarely finds peace. And over time, the body begins feeling what the mind carries: tension, sleeplessness, fatigue, digestive discomfort, anxiety, emotional burnout. And often, people do not even realize worry is part of the reason they feel so tired. They simply think, I guess I am getting older, but perhaps the heart is just exhausted. Exhausted from trying to protect against futures that have not happened. Today, we gently reflect on this question. How much of your suffering comes from things that have not even happened yet? The Buddha often reminded people to return to the present moment, not because the future does not matter, but because living emotionally trapped inside tomorrow steals today. The future is uncertain. It always has been. Even when we were young, we simply felt more powerful back then, more certain, more distracted, but uncertainty has always existed. The truth is, life has never promised guarantees, not for health, not for relationships, not for money, not for plans. And strangely, the more tightly we try to control uncertainty, the more anxiety grows. Dear friends, many people believe worrying proves love. If I stop worrying about my family, maybe I don't care enough. But worry and love are not the same thing. Love supports, love encourages, love shows up. Worry often overwhelms and quietly drains emotional energy. You can love deeply without mentally suffering every possible outcome. You can care without carrying the weight of tomorrow every single day. The Buddha gently taught again and again. This moment matters, not yesterday, not imagined disasters, not fears about next year. This breath, this day, this moment, because dear friends, Most of life quietly unfolds in ordinary moments we accidentally miss while worrying about the future. Imagine carrying an umbrella every day because someday it might rain. Reasonable, perhaps. Now imagine wearing a heavy winter coat every day, in every season, because winter might come eventually. Eventually, the body becomes exhausted. Worry works like that. At first, it feels responsible, then slowly. It becomes emotional over-preparation. Living inside imagined danger, bracing for loss before loss happens. Feeling grief before grief arrives. And perhaps the hardest part, many people do not even realize how much energy worry steals. They simply feel tired, emotionally flat, unable to relax, unable to enjoy peaceful moments, because somewhere inside, the nervous system never stops scanning for problems. Dear friends, please remember this. You cannot solve tomorrow tonight. You cannot protect yourself from every uncertainty, and perhaps most importantly, you do not need to emotionally rehearse suffering before it arrives. Perhaps tonight, before sleep, you might gently whisper to yourself, I have done enough for today. Tomorrow does not need me tonight. This moment is safe enough to rest. Sometimes, peace begins with something very small. Permission to stop carrying tomorrow for just one evening. There was a woman named Susan. She was 61 years old, living in a quiet town outside Nashville for most of her life. People described Susan as caring, responsible, the kind of person who always thought ahead. She remembered birthdays, checked on neighbors, helped family members, always prepared for problems before they happened. At first, this seemed like a beautiful quality, and in many ways it was, but quietly, something else was growing beneath it. Fear, constant fear. The kind that never fully rested. When her children were young, she worried about school. When they became teenagers, she worried about bad influences. When they grew into adults, she worried about jobs, relationships, finances, health, and somehow, even when things were going well, Susan still found something to fear. Her daughter was doing fine financially. Still, Susan worried she might secretly be struggling. Her son had a healthy marriage. Still, Susan worried they might divorce someday. Her husband, Michael, looked healthy. Still, she constantly feared losing him. At night, fear grew louder. Her body lay in bed, but her mind stayed awake. What if something happened? What if someone got sick? What if money became tight? What if retirement failed? What if? Michael would gently whisper beside her. Susan tried to sleep. She would sigh softly, I am trying. But deep down, she wasn't resting. She was preparing emotionally for disasters that had not happened. Year after year, slowly, her body began responding: poor sleep, tension, headaches, anxiety, fatigue, digestive discomfort, a heaviness she could not explain, and strangely, even beautiful moments became harder to enjoy. Family vacations, holiday dinners, Sunday afternoons, part of her was always somewhere else, in tomorrow, in fear, in imagined problems. One evening during dinner, her daughter smiled and said, Mom, you know you don't have to worry about us all the time, right? Susan laughed awkwardly. That's what moms do. But later that night, the sentence stayed with her. Do I worry because I love, or have I forgotten how to love without worrying? Weeks later, during a routine checkup, her doctor gently mentioned stress. Your body feels tired, he said. Not sick exactly, just tired. Then he asked something unexpected. When was the last time your mind truly rested? Susan did not know how to answer, because honestly, she could not remember. A few months later, a friend invited her to a mindfulness retreat weekend. Susan nearly declined. Too busy, too many responsibilities, too many things to think about. But eventually, something inside whispered, maybe you need this. The retreat was simple. Quiet, no dramatic teachings, just stillness, walking slowly, breathing, sitting in silence at first. Susan hated it. Her thoughts felt louder than ever. Her worries rushed in. Bills, children, health. The future, everything. But one afternoon during a talk, the teacher said something that stopped her completely. Worry does not prevent suffering. It only makes you suffer twice. The room became still. Then came another sentence. Love does not require fear. You can care deeply without carrying imagined tragedy every day. Something inside Susan softened. Because for the first time, she realized she had confused worry with love. She thought suffering emotionally proved devotion. She thought fear meant responsibility, but really, it had only made her tired, so very tired, slowly. She began changing small things before bed. She started writing worries down in a journal, then closing it. Symbolically saying, enough for today. When anxious thoughts came, she practiced breathing instead of spiraling. She walked more, watched sunsets, called her children without secretly checking for signs of disaster. Little by little, life became lighter, not perfect, but lighter. Months later, during a family barbecue, her daughter hugged her and smiled. "You seem happier lately." Susan laughed softly. "I think I finally stopped trying to save everyone from imaginary problems, and for the first time in years." She truly meant it. Dear friends, perhaps there is a Susan somewhere inside many of us, a heart that worries because it loves, a mind that never fully rests, a nervous system quietly exhausted from carrying futures that have not arrived. Please hear this gently. Your love is beautiful, your caring matters, but worry is not the same thing as love. Love supports, worry suffers in advance. Love trusts, worry fears endlessly. Love stays present, worry disappears into tomorrow. Perhaps the greatest kindness you can offer yourself after 50 is permission to stop emotionally rehearsing every possible disaster. You do not need to carry tomorrow tonight. You do not need to solve every uncertainty. And perhaps the people you love need your peaceful presence more than your constant fear. Sometimes letting go is not giving up. Sometimes letting go is finally resting. Dear friends, let us gently move into the third thing many people hold onto so tightly that it quietly creates stress, tension, and emotional suffering, and that is the need to control everything. This one is subtle. Very subtle, because most people do not call it control. They call it responsibility, preparation. Being careful, wanting the best, trying to protect loved ones, and often it comes from love, good intentions. Fear or past pain, especially after 50, because life begins changing in ways we cannot fully manage. Children make their own decisions, relationships shift, health changes, retirement arrives, the body changes. Unexpected events happen, and somewhere inside, many people begin tightening their grip, trying harder, planning more, worrying more, fixing more, controlling more, because uncertainty feels frightening. Have you ever noticed this? Sometimes the harder we try to control life, the more exhausted we become. Because life keeps reminding us, not everything can be controlled, not people, not time, not outcomes, not aging, not health, not the future, and yet the mind resists. The mind says, if I just try harder, if I plan better, if everyone would listen, maybe things will finally feel safe. Dear friends, please hear this gently. The desire for control is deeply human, especially if life has hurt you before. Especially if chaos once entered your life unexpectedly. Especially if responsibility has always lived on your shoulders. Control often begins as self-protection, but over time, protection can quietly become pressure, and pressure becomes emotional exhaustion. The Buddha taught something profoundly freeing. Suffering often grows from attachment to how things must be. how people should behave, how life should unfold. But life rarely follows perfect plans. People disappoint us. Health surprises us. Loss arrives uninvited. Unexpected change appears. And the tighter we grip, the more painful uncertainty becomes. Dear friends, control can quietly steal peace, because peace and control rarely live in the same room. Control demands certainty. Peace learns to breathe without it. Today, we gently reflect on this question. What part of life are you gripping too tightly right now? The Buddha often reminded people that impermanence touches everything. Everything changes, everything shifts, nothing stays fixed forever, and strangely, this truth can feel frightening at first. Because many people spend life searching for guarantees, permanent security, permanent certainty, permanent outcomes. But perhaps peace does not come from certainty. Perhaps peace comes from learning how to live gently inside uncertainty. Many people after 50 quietly exhaust themselves trying to manage everyone else's lives: children, grandchildren, spouses, finances, health, schedules, family dynamics, and often, their hearts become tired, not because they stopped loving, but because they never stopped caring. The truth is, you can care deeply without controlling everything. You can love your family without trying to rescue every mistake. You can support others without carrying their entire future. Dear friends, sometimes love becomes unhealthy when fear disguises itself as control, and often, the people we try hardest to protect simply want something different from us. Not control, not fixing, not pressure but presence, understanding, patience, peace. Imagine trying to hold water tightly in your hand. The tighter you squeeze, the faster it slips away. Life often works this way. Relationships too, children especially. Sometimes the harder we hold, the more tension we create. And perhaps the deepest exhaustion comes from trying to control things that were never ours to control in the first place. Other people's decisions, other people's healing, other people's timing, other people's mistakes. Dear friends, this does not mean giving up. It does not mean becoming careless. It simply means learning the difference between supporting and controlling. Supporting says, I trust you enough to grow. Control says, I am afraid if I let go. Supporting creates connection. Control often creates tension. And perhaps tonight, you may gently ask yourself, what am I trying too hard to control? Has control brought me peace or exhaustion? Sometimes, the deepest healing begins not when life changes, but when we finally soften our grip. There was a woman named Linda. She was 64 years old, living in Arizona with her husband after retirement. Most people described Linda as loving, organized, protective, the kind of mother who always cared deeply for her family, and in many ways, she truly did. She remembered every birthday, checked on everyone constantly, cooked for holidays, offered advice, solved problems, helped whenever anyone struggled. Her heart was generous, but quietly. Something else had grown alongside that love. Control, not harsh control, not obvious control, the kind disguised as caring. The kind many people never recognize, especially parents, especially after 50. Linda had 2 grown children. Her daughter, Emily, lived in Seattle with her husband. Her son, Daniel, had recently moved to Texas for work. And even though both children were adults, Linda still worried constantly, not only worried, managed. Suggested, corrected, advised, planned. She called Emily several times a week, asking questions, giving opinions. Sometimes without being asked, are you sure you should spend money on that? You should really think about buying a house. Did you schedule your annual checkup? What about retirement savings? Emily loved her mother, but sometimes the conversations felt heavy, like being managed instead of supported. One evening after dinner, Emily gently said, "Mom, I love you, but sometimes I feel like you don't trust me to handle my own life." The sentence landed hard. Linda immediately felt defensive. "I am just trying to help. I am your mother. I care." Emily nodded softly. "I know, but sometimes caring feels like pressure." Linda barely slept that night. Part of her felt hurt. Ungrateful, she thought, after everything I've done. But another part of her quietly wondered, was Emily right? Meanwhile, things were not easier with Daniel. He rarely called anymore. Short texts, brief updates. Distance growing. Linda secretly felt rejected, unimportant, so she tried harder, more calls, more advice. More reminders, but strangely, the harder she tried to hold the family close, the farther things sometimes felt. One afternoon, over lunch with a close friend, Linda sighed. "I don't understand. I've done everything for my kids. Why does it feel like we're drifting apart?" Her friend paused gently, then asked, "Can I ask you something?" Linda nodded. "Are you supporting them or trying to manage them?" The question stung, but stayed with her. Weeks later, Linda attended a mindfulness workshop at a nearby community center. During a quiet discussion, the teacher said something unexpected. "Control often hides fear." The room became quiet. Then the teacher continued, "Sometimes we try to control what we love because we are afraid of losing it." Linda felt her chest tighten. Because suddenly, she understood. She wasn't controlling because she was demanding. She was controlling because she was scared. Scared her children would struggle. Scared they would drift away. Scared she would no longer feel needed. Scared of becoming irrelevant. And underneath all of it, scared of loneliness. Then came another sentence that quietly changed something inside her. "Love grows stronger when fear loosens its grip." That sentence stayed with her for days, then weeks. Slowly, Linda began changing, not dramatically, not perfectly, just gently. When Emily called, she listened more, advised less, instead of solving problems immediately. She asked, "How are you feeling about it?" When Daniel forgot to call, she stopped assuming the worst. Stopped creating painful stories in her mind. Stopped interpreting distance as rejection. Little by little, something softened. The conversations felt lighter, warmer, more natural. One evening, Emily called unexpectedly. "Mom," she said softly, "you feel different lately." Linda smiled. "How?" "You listen more and honestly. It feels really nice." Linda laughed quietly, then unexpectedly. Her eyes filled with tears because she realized something important. Control had not brought closeness. Peace had, trust had, gentleness had. Months later, at a family dinner, Daniel hugged her goodbye and said, "Mom, thanks for giving me space," then smiled warmly, but also for always being there. And for the first time in years, Linda felt something she had not realized she was missing: relief. She no longer felt responsible for carrying everyone else's life, only for loving them well. Dear friends, perhaps there is a Linda somewhere inside many of us, someone trying so hard to protect what matters. That love quietly turns into pressure. Please hear this gently. Control is often fear wearing the clothes of responsibility. Fear of loss, fear of failure, fear of uncertainty, fear of not being needed anymore. But dear friends, love does not need to grip tightly to remain real. Sometimes, the deepest form of love is trust, trusting life, trusting growth, trusting the people we care about, trusting that not every problem belongs to us. You are allowed to care deeply without carrying everyone else's future. You are allowed to love without controlling every outcome. And perhaps, the peace you have been searching for begins the moment you stop trying to hold life so tightly. Dear friends, as we come to the end of today's reflection, perhaps the deepest wisdom we can carry forward is this: Sometimes the things making us suffer are not the things happening to us. Sometimes the suffering comes from what we refuse to put down, what we continue carrying, what we continue gripping tightly, even when it has already become too heavy. Today we gently reflected on things many people quietly hold onto after 50. Resentment, fear, control. Invisible emotional burdens that slowly grow heavier over time, not because anyone intends to suffer, not because life has gone wrong, but because the heart learns survival before it learns peace. Many people spend decades becoming responsible, strong, dependable, protective, hardworking, resilient. And these are beautiful qualities, truly beautiful, but somewhere along the way, many people forget something essential. How to rest emotionally, how to soften, how to stop carrying what no longer belongs to today. Dear friends, there comes a season in life when strength no longer looks like holding on. Sometimes, strength begins looking like release. Like breathing deeper, like forgiving, like trusting, like allowing yourself peace, especially after 50. Because after 50, the body becomes more honest, the nervous system becomes more sensitive, stress lingers longer. Sleep becomes lighter, the emotional weight we once ignored becomes harder to carry, and perhaps this is not punishment. Perhaps this is wisdom quietly arriving, life gently whispering, you no longer need to carry everything. Perhaps this season of life is inviting something different, not more struggle, not more emotional battles, not more pressure, but peace, stillness, compassion, a softer relationship with yourself, and perhaps a softer relationship with life. The Buddha taught again and again that suffering deepens when we cling too tightly. Not because attachment makes us weak, but because gripping creates tension, fear, resistance, exhaustion. And often, the tighter we hold, the more tired we become. Dear friends, what if peace is not something we earn someday? What if peace begins the moment we loosen our grip? The moment we stop replaying old hurt? The moment we stop mentally rehearsing disasters? The moment we stop trying to control every outcome? The moment we finally whisper, I have carried enough? Perhaps some of you listening today are tired, not physically, but emotionally, tired from overthinking, tired from protecting everyone, tired from carrying disappointment, tired from trying to stay strong, tired from old pain, tired from responsibilities that never seem to end. If that is you, please hear this gently. You are allowed to rest. You are allowed to breathe. You are allowed to stop carrying everything alone. You are allowed to stop punishing yourself for being human, because, dear friends, healing often begins with permission. Permission to let go, permission to soften, permission to forgive, permission to stop fighting battles that no longer need fighting. You do not have to heal overnight. You do not have to suddenly become peaceful. Life does not work that way. Healing is slow, tender, human. Sometimes healing begins with one honest sentence: I am tired of suffering this way. Sometimes it begins with forgiveness, sometimes with rest, sometimes with prayer, sometimes with silence, sometimes with simply sitting quietly and asking, what am I still carrying that no longer belongs in my heart? And perhaps, little by little, you begin setting things down. The resentment softens, fear loosens. Control relaxes, breathing deepens, sleep returns, peace slowly visits again, not because life suddenly became perfect, but because you stopped making your heart carry what was never meant to stay forever. Dear friends, please remember this. Holding on is not always strength. Sometimes, holding on becomes suffering and letting go. Letting go is not weakness. Sometimes, letting go is wisdom. Sometimes, letting go is healing. Sometimes, letting go is how we quietly save ourselves. So tonight, before sleep, perhaps place your hand gently over your heart. Take one slow breath and whisper softly, "What can I release today? What burden no longer belongs to me? How can I be gentler with myself?" Because peace does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrives quietly. The moment the heart decides, "I no longer want to carry this alone." If today's reflection brought even a small sense of comfort, please subscribe to Buddha's Healing and continue this healing journey with us. And if there is something your heart has been holding too tightly, feel free to gently share it in the comments. Sometimes healing begins when we finally stop carrying pain in silence. May your heart grow lighter, may your sleep grow softer, and may peace find its way back to you, one gentle breath at a time.